Good afternoon. My name is Dave Lumenta. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Anthropology, Universitas Indonesia, and I was asked to deliver a keynote speech, which I promise will be short. Um, the title of my speech will be Decolonizing Culture from the Nation State, What Artists Can Teach Us. There seems to be a disconnect in how nation states define culture, such as in cultural diplomacy, and how culture is shaped, experienced, and practiced by normal people. And by that I mean artists. The initiative set by the International Forum on the Spice Route provides us an opportunity, I think, to rethink our cultural connections and how it worked in the past. How is culture produced and shaped in the vernacular sense? The immense cultural context that existed throughout Asia was facilitated by the long standing trading networks, as we know, and all the interlocking circuits that spanned from the Western Pacific all the way to East Africa, from the Lesser Sunda Islands, Nusa Tenggara, up to the steppes in Central Asia, from the so called Far East all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. These cultural contexts were always initiated through the encounters of people, whether they are individuals, for example, traders, Brahmins, monks, Hadrami sojourners, slaves, sometimes between diasporic and host communities, through intermarriage, forced labor, even, and many other means. They were not contacts, as we like to imagine today, between official cultural ambassadors or governments. They were all done through people to people contact. And they were not programmatic, but rather shaped by pragmatic opportunities, historical contingencies, and shifting geographical interconnectedness. And they were also constrained by the various existing transportation, communication technologies that were available at the time, which also shaped the myriad of ways by which people moved around, how people then communicated and interacted. So it was, in a sense, a very organic process, how culture developed, how culture shaped uh, geographical links, or how culture was the consequence of geographical links, how it was facilitated by the movement of individuals, people, etc. Colonialism and the emergence of nation states has reconfigured the way we think about interconnections. It has reconfigured the ways in how we think about space. It has reconfigured our ways in how we think about culture. Colonialism has divorced many regions in Asia and Africa from its long standing geographical links. The way the West perceived the world as partitions of continents, Europe here, Africa there, Asia here, has alienated many Asians from its own rich cosmopolitan histories. For example, how many Asians are unaware of the rich history that exists in the Indian Ocean, which link Asia and Africa, for example? In the current post-colonial condition, nationalism that emerged throughout the colonial world in Asia and Africa during the struggles of independence soon degraded from being very progressive, liberating decolonization ideologies to becoming merely parochial silos of national identities. The nation state, one of the most unnatural of all human inventions, arguably, has become so naturalized as the normative way of how humans should be organized. Ironically, one could argue that post colonial Asian and African states have inherited and reproduced the core of colonial spatial logic, namely the organization of the world into territorial silos. As a consequence, culture is seen as bounded, it is seen as being a property or even a commodity of the national geobody. It is seen as a fixed and static heritage, This notion is disseminated very often through, for example, national education. As a result, for example, many Indonesians are not aware of the cosmopolitan origins of their own cultures. How many of us are aware of the influence of Persia on Malay music and language? Or how many of us are aware about the influence of the Chinese measurement systems in our local economies, such as gantang, kati, pikul? Or how many of us are aware that there was already a South Indian trading diaspora in the 6th century on the northwestern coast of Sumatra, and that these communities were very instrumental in spreading the Sanskrit language and the Pali script throughout the Nusantara? Or conversely, how many of us Indonesians know about the domesticated use of Javanese gamelan in other musical forms throughout Southeast Asia, from the Philippines to Cambodia, etc.? So, from a cultural perspective, the notion of boundaries, national boundaries, remain problematic. Cultures never developed within nation states, but emerged as the consequence of translocal contact, adaptation, encounters, domestication, and diffusion across geographical regions, transcending the national time space. Culture, which emerged and spread without the existing notion of borders, is now treated as national properties to be jealously guarded against neighboring others. One may remember the example when Indonesia accused Malaysia of stealing Indonesian culture, an absurd proposition. I would argue that this would be another frontier to decolonize, decoupling culture from national identity politics. Take also, for example, how we travel today. Travel has increasingly been viewed from the optics of crossing national boundaries. These optics also shape how nation states view their roles in the cultural realm. Indonesian artists, or even migrant workers traveling abroad, are often expected to act as duta budaya, to act as cultural ambassadors or cultural branding ambassadors to represent our national image. This reveals the problematic when nation states formulate, for example, cultural diplomacy, where something as human as cultural contact is now subservient to the politics of differences. What goes unnoticed is that many Indonesian artists, migrant workers, because so many Indonesians they travel, many have actually forged their own transnational networks outside the cultural frame of the state. In the art scene, for example, Ruang Rupa, an art collective based in Jakarta, was chosen to create the 2022 Europalia art exhibition in Germany. And it did so by seeing itself as a vernacular representative of the global south, not as an Indonesian cultural ambassador. To take another example in the music scene, Indonesian musicians for the past 20 years have found audiences in various Asian, African, and North American music scenes. Maybe to take, for example, White Shoes and the Couples Company, Burger Kill, Voice of Baceprot, Gabber Modus Operandi, GMO, just to name a few. And they worked independently without needing state endorsement. Another example is the Indonesian musician Kasimin, who was formerly a member of Gabber Modus Operandi, and now also often performs with the stage name Hulu Balang. He has traveled and collaborated, for example, with African musicians in Africa, working with Ugandan and Kenyan musicians to explore cultural possibilities under a pan-Asian African identity. So even Kasimin sees himself more as an Asian working in Africa rather than an Indonesian. To take a reverse example, there is an artist by the name of Hanif Hamras. And he is a refugee from Afghanistan. He was a musician. And he is still held up in Jakarta because he's still waiting for resettlement to a third country. But during his time in Indonesia, despite being prohibited to work, to legally work in Indonesia, he has been collaborating with many musicians around Jakarta and West Java. He often collaborates, for example, with the Balinese sitar player, Made Santana, and he also collaborated with numbers of Sundanese kendang musicians. And just to note, these are all organic collaborations without institutional support or without the framing of cultural collaboration in a formal sense. All these examples demonstrate how generic cultural contexts in the contemporary world are forged, not dissimilar from how culture has always been shaped through the finding of similarities, through the forging of personal and communal social relations, to create understanding, and to build solidarity. Contemporary cultural collaboration is often oriented towards finding common human possibilities and to find alternative social imaginations to tackle the problems that we all face today. Many artists, whether they are Indonesian or whether they are considered Asian, African, European, American, tend to see themselves rather as a part of a broader cosmopolitan identity. The national identity is now rather seen as a rather outdated straitjacket that would have less relevance in a world that is becoming increasingly beset by multiple crises and the bleak future caused by national inactions on tackling the climate crisis. Artists teach us that global solidarity should be our common goal instead of national identity politics. This is even shared also among the global labor movement, the global indigenous people movement, the global climate movement. So national identity politics is now seen as a hindrance to achieving global solidarity. And for us in Indonesia, the state perhaps needs to rethink how it views culture and the arts. Maybe it can learn from how normal people actually do culture in contexts that really matter. Thank you.